You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Scott Bernstein. That's right, Scott is the founder of the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago and many other organizations and ideas you know well. The Housing Plus Transportation Affordability Index, the Surface Transportation Policy Project. Scott was on President Clinton's Council for Sustainable Development. He was an original signer of the Charter for the New Urbanism, co-founded the Center for TOD, and much, much more. I'd like to have Scott come back for a series of shows to talk about a ton of issues, so I hope you all enjoyed this episode where we talk about poverty and strategies to reduce it in cities. So welcome to this episode of Mondays with Scott. All right, before we get to the show, this week and every week I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You all keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without you, so thank you so much. And if you don't support the show but thought that perhaps you'd like to, you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, and we're super appreciative of that as well. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note, and $10 a month will get you the bus-only scarf with dedicated lane designs. So if you want one of our bus-only scarves, in addition to being a $10 a month supporter on Patreon, you can get the scarf by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. And if you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. This book was fun to produce, and if you're a History of Planning fan, it's the very first one listed on the American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. All right, let's talk to Scott. Scott, I think the best way to start is to kind of introduce yourself and let folks know that are listening, like who you are and where you come from and all those things.
Hi, I'm Scott Bernstein. I'm the recently retired founder of the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, which helps communities identify and capture the value of sustainable development inclusively. And something I did for 42 years. In practice, that meant coming up with metrics, methods of setting goals, and helping people achieve plans, and the financing that went with those plans to achieve those goals, ranging from energy efficiency to better transportation choices, better development that used those transportation choices productively, as in transit-oriented development, and other tangible and intangible investments in what we usually call the public realm. CNT was a co-founder of the community development movement of the Congress for New Urbanism, of Smart Growth America, the Surface Transportation Policy Project, and I currently serve as board president of the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, founding board member and treasurer of the Shared Use Mobility Center, and I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I get tired just going through all that.
That's okay. You've done a lot of stuff and you continue to do a lot of stuff. How did you get into cities? Like, what was the impetus for you being interested in thinking about all of these ways to improve urban issues, urban relationships?
Sure. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park, which is today one of the more desirable, successful TODs in the country. But when we were living there, people were running away from Chicago as fast as they could. My parents were easily panic pedaled out of Hyde Park. We landed in Park Forest, a place that was an experimental community in the early 50s, famous for being an effort to try and show that suburbs could be planned and work. It was the kind of place the guy who had organized it, Phil Klutznick, would throw out the first ball at the Little League every year and tell us if we kept our noses clean, went to school, got a degree, we could get out of there too. So our parents were lucky. Somehow the narrative was that they'd gotten out of Chicago and we could just keep right on marching to someplace else too, I guess. When I was in college, I was fortunate to work with a group of people at Northwestern University, John McKnight and Stan Hallett, who believed that the problems with cities were that we weren't willing to renew and reinvest in them, and that we thought we were doing that as professionals by urging people to get advanced degrees in urban affairs or in medical care or in education or in even community security and policing. But the more we invested in those institutions, the worse the indicators of, say, morbidity and mortality, or the reading scores, or communities' feelings of security and well-being became. And so the question was, maybe we should be inventing new kinds of institutions that were dedicated to putting the ability to make decisions and improve communities as close as possible to the people who had to live with them. That got me interested in working with some community organizations in the poorest community on the west side of Chicago. And indeed, we were able to show that the biggest reasons for use of the local emergency rooms, things like personal attacks and traffic crashes and even dog bites, were a function of a system sort of out of whack, out of control, not oriented towards building livable places. And nobody ever looked at that data and did that kind of translation of crashes. You know, medical record might say broken tibia, broken bone, but it needed to say twilight pedestrian automobile collision at the corner of Madison and Pulaski when it was raining and the lights were up.
How'd you come up with those data points if they didn't exist at the time?
Well, I had had work experience designing medical record systems the year before. And when this community organization, the Christian Action Ministry, which later spawned a very large community organization, Bethel New Life, came to Northwestern and said, how can we make people healthier? Our question back was, well, what's the problem? When we realized we had to be able to translate those records, we got permission from a friendly hospital administrator, and I have to admit this was strictly illegal, to go through a year's worth of medical records. And since I had the experience, I got stuck with actually running a team from everybody from postdocs to interns to figure it out. So we went through 22,300 medical records and did that translation. And it's fascinating. We wanted to make sure we weren't looking at a false read, a particular year sample or what have you. So we got permission to hang out at the emergency room and talk to people while they were waiting to see a doctor and ask them what happened. The one I remember from that one was the guy who I talked to for 2 hours. His first answer to that question was, I got stabbed at Cabrini Green, which now doesn't exist, famous high-rise public housing. And there just aren't enough CHA security guards. And he kept repeating that. And at the end of the interview, I remembered to ask him, so what do you do for a living? And he said, well, I'm a CHA security guard. So I figured he ought to know. And then we wanted even more validating information. We were fascinated with the finding that there were so many traffic crashes. So we got permission to get the printed hard copy, Centronics printer printed records of where traffic crashes happened. And back then, this was in the early 70s, you filled out an incident report. There was a 6-part carbon copy. And one of those went to something called the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which was then the Chicago Area Transportation Study. And they geographically coded these to latitude and longitude and printed them out and very carefully folded them up. And when we got there, nobody had ever looked at them. They were full of dust. And so we had to translate those into something that could be understood by the mapping software at the time, which had to be entered by hand, by key punch into punch cards. We finally got maps to print. And then we got intersections out of that. And we had lots of volunteers. And we sent them out to the high incident intersections, and we didn't have long to wait. We could see people being victimized by the traffic system. The group institutionalized this program. We helped them raise money. The people they hired were given the title of health detectives, and they were grassroots epidemiologists looking for the ecological connections where some community intervention could make a difference. And we did that with dog bites. We did that with community nutrition. And each one of those resulted in a program that seemed to make people feel they were making a difference.
That sounds like a TV show, The Health Detectives.
Yeah, really, it felt like it. Honestly, I'm leaving the more graphic parts out of it.
That's probably a good idea. But that kind of leads into our discussion today about data and thinking about poverty and some other things. Let's chat a little bit about this poverty issue that's happening in the United States. I think the first thing I want to understand is what poverty actually means, what it actually means when you say people are in poverty. There's probably different definitions.
Right. Well, like a lot of things in the U.S., it's officially designated by a body. In this case, the definition rests with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census. Poverty is a condition that is met when the cohort you're part of, which I'll explain, earns below a certain target level. So the amount of money that you're earning if you're an adult and you're a single adult for you to be in poverty is lower than if you're, let's say, a family, married, a couple, or married with kids. That's another cohort. Or a single mom with kids, or single mom with other adult earning in the household. It gets more complex when you think about how you count this for kids who are part of a household and people who are disabled. And you end up with, I think we're up to 42 separate cohorts of people, and there is a poverty line established for each of those, and it's adjusted every year. It goes back to studies done 1918 and 19, and then again from 1934 to 1936, when the reigning idea was that you ought to be able to meet a certain standard of living, and you could measure that by the amount of goods and services that you were able to buy compared to needs. And it was priced at a time that doesn't look anything like now. When this was started, transportation was a trivial cost, for example, at the beginning of the last century. Only the wealthy owned individual means of transportation. And streetcars cost a canonical nickel or a dime a ride. But wages were pretty low. And until about 1920 or so, the three expenses to beat were food, clothing, and shelter, in that order. So when the idea of coming up with a poverty line was created, the woman economist who came up with it, her statistics seemed to show that this poverty line ought to be roughly 3 times what it costs you to eat in your cohort. And so in other words, another way of saying that would be that, much like we talk about housing shouldn't cost more than 30% of income today, then the thought was that food shouldn't cost more than 33% of income. Food today is at around, for most places, 14, 15%. Transportation just was hardly tracked in the original Bureau of Labor Statistics. So anyway, they created these standards, they translated them into these index numbers. Of course, they were measuring the consumer price index to see how the prices of individual items per unit cost, but that doesn't tell you how much people are actually spending. So they created a consumer expenditure survey, and that's how all this got created. So we have these 42 poverty lines, even though every single press release I've ever read has the phrase in it, the poverty line.
The line.
Right. And it goes down to very low. The highest it can be is for a household with a minimum of 4, but it's really 5 or more persons in it. And I think it's up to $26,500 per year. And it goes down from there. Another way to think of it, so you could have a household earning $30,000, but that might be comprised of 2 $15,000 incomes, and you'd have 3 people in poverty. 2 out of the 3 people would be employed and old enough to work, so their contribution would be to the employment rate, not the unemployment rate. But in the aggregate, they can't afford to pay the cost of living, at least not meet a quality standard of living.
Mm-hmm.
And the poverty designation is supposed to be able to catch that.
Should this designation be rethought?
The last time it was rethought, it was about 10, 12 years ago. Congress commissioned a study of something called the Supplemental Poverty Measure that was intended to take a much closer and modern look at the cost of living. They did take our recommendation to include the cost of commuting more explicitly. It's interesting. I got a call out of the blue after we commented on it for the Federal Register from a very quiet-sounding woman who turned out to be the chief expenditure economist for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And she thanked personally for the submittal and apologized. She said, we missed your entire body of research. It was very helpful later in our revisions to the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, and when we worked with HUD and DOT to convert that into something during the Obama administration called the Location Affordability Index.
Early on, I think I remember seeing in the streetcar book that we put together, I remember, I think, seeing expenditures maybe at the turn of the century were around 2% or something along those lines. I imagine you have that number.
Oh, if you pushed it, you could make it 2%. I mean, it's just Carrie McCarowitz, and I think you had Carrie on your show recently.
Yeah.
And I have written a paper on affordability, the history of an idea. It sort of traces these things. I mean, if I go back to the first consumer expenditure survey done nationally, 1891, the money spent on transportation was deemed to be statistically insignificant.
Is there a chance we can get back to that point?
Oh, absolutely. We just need to change our priorities. You could wonder, think about those first couple of income quintiles. Households making $6,000 a year, $17,000 a year, even $27,000 a year. Are they making it, right? And the answer is no, on a couple of different levels. First, on a human level, on the quality of life, no. Secondly, can they afford to pay even the services that they're living with? No. So the average expenditures for that bottom 10% are actually $26,000 a year, but they're only earning $6,000 a year. So they need to make up a gap of almost $20,000 a year. So how do we think people are possibly making it? And the answer is they're not.
Is that just like running up debt? Are they borrowing from friends?
A lot of it is living off your credit card. A lot of it is finding ways to share expenses, but a lot of it is hoping for in-kind services, whether they're publicly supported or not, to help you pay the cost or to discount transit pass. So maybe you'll find some way to get by, or to directly subsidize the cost of housing. Interesting fact about these figures is that for the first and second and third income quintile, after-tax income is actually slightly higher than pre-tax income. But that's because everybody in those income levels automatically qualifies if they file for an earned income tax credit, which is why people like that so much. It's the closest thing you've got to force majeure for giving people money.
Right.
Help them file their taxes and they will get a check.
So what are some of the things that we can do to get people out of poverty? I mean, you mentioned a number of things, housing, transportation, but there's a number of other things as well that can add on to that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the principle is really simple. You've got basically three ways to bring these negative numbers to positive numbers. One is you can help them actually earn more income. That goes into education, on the job training, workforce development, in order to help people qualify for jobs that would actually result in paying a living wage. That's one thing you can do. One problem with that strategy is, let's say I give you an extra $1 an hour. Let's say you're working 2,000 hours a year. I mean, chances are you won't get $2,000, and most jurisdictions I'm aware of will tax you. You'll pay income taxes on that. But it's a strategy, and at the moment, it's the preferred strategy, by the way. Ask anybody, what do we do to get people out of poverty? Education and training. That's what people equate with it. All right, let's go to strategy number 2, which is you can subsidize or pay in kind the cost of services. You can pay somebody's rent for them. You could buy them a dwelling. You could give them a car. You could give them a prepaid transit pass forever, and so forth. And is that a good strategy? I mean, it's okay, and it's necessary, and it's going to take a while, even if we're committed to poverty eradication and, in effect, to equity to get there. But there's only going to be some people who need help, and figuring out a way to do it that not only helps people with their own impoverishment, but maybe is good for the economy too, would be preferable. So that brings us to strategy number 3, which would be investing to reduce the cost of living. Now, in this case, if I give you a package of services that actually reduce your cost of living by $1 an hour over 2,000 hours, so you're saving $2,000 a year. First of all, I can't tax you on that. There is no productivity tax. So on that third one, to actually get people not only $1 an hour, but several dollars an hour worth of savings, when I said invest, it's not just some soft services. I mean, if you want to help somebody actually, let's say, save a lot of money on their home heating and electrical bill, telling people to turn down their thermostat and turn off the lights only goes so far.
Right. Or change to LEDs.
Right. Well, and you're probably going to have to invest some money in making the home or the apartment or the building of the apartment more efficient, and that's going to take some investment. But on the other hand, it is investment, and it's very labor-intensive investment. Maybe every $50,000 or $60,000 invested is supporting, let's say, 3 medium wage and 1 higher wage job. And a whole bunch of them are people who will only need the equivalent of, let's say, an on-the-job training program or a AA degree out of a community college. And maybe one person will need to be college trained. That's based on analysis of programs C&T and others have run. And so you're creating jobs from that kind of activity. You're creating jobs by buying materials. You're creating jobs because eventually the money that you're helping people save, and remember, in this discussion, we're talking about the population in poverty. It'll be a while before they have money to put into a savings account. So the money will get respent in the economy, and that will give you what sometimes is called a multiplier effect. So they will be buying goods and services that they weren't able to before, and that improves the economy. So we started asking a question, would it be possible to come up with a standard method of identifying the population in poverty in a place, and based on the nature of the place and what's there and who's trying to do what, come up with a plan to reduce poverty by a targeted amount in a place? And lo and behold, I got a call one day from somebody who said the mayor of Memphis was looking for a way to plan on how to reduce the crushing poverty rate in Memphis, which was 27%, 10 points higher than in most of the South, down to 17%. So Mayor Wharton at the time and I met. The Memphis Blueprint for Prosperity was created to do that. Now, unfortunately, Mayor Wharton didn't win his reelection bid, and the implementation of this plan has been on hold, although elements of it appear in language in the recently adopted new Memphis Comprehensive Plan, Memphis 3.0. We worked with the Knight Foundation to do sample poverty reduction plans for the cities in which they directly operate with people on the ground. So that was Akron, Cary, Indiana, Detroit, Philadelphia, Charlotte, North Carolina, Miami-Dade County, Macon, Georgia, Long Beach, California, St. Paul, Minnesota, and San Jose, California, too. So for each one of these, we would look at major cost centers of households like transportation and energy and water utilities and food, housing, medical care, child care is a big deal. We looked at what it would take to sort of boost the availability and the affordability of those services and aided budgets for what we called poverty reduction. So you would think of the dollar that could be earned from income in the earlier example I gave you and the dollar that could be saved from cost of living reduction as a poverty reduction benefit. Certainly, if you could do both, increase income and cut costs, whatever progress you'd be making towards poverty reduction would be twice as fast as if you'd only done the first and not the second. And so it turned out you would need to spend about $5,200 per capita in the poverty population per year for 10 years to do that. Came to about a couple $100 million a year, but it was really a tiny fraction of the GDP of the Memphis region. So that got people's attention that it really wasn't as expensive as you might think if you were going into this cold without any of the analysis. Eventually, last year, we migrated the original tool, which was on all these spreadsheets and hard to follow, onto a website. And people listening to this can go right now for no cost to UOA, which stands for Urban Opportunity Agenda.cnt.org. And the data is already loaded up with the algorithms for the cities with the 100 largest poverty rates in the United States. So we've got some cities, I think, for every state. And it allows you to not only see what's possible, but to concoct your own poverty reduction plan.
In an example like Memphis, you mentioned 5,200 per capita. What goes into that?
So here's a couple interesting things about Memphis. Memphis has a public utility that sells gas, light, and water, and it brags about having the cheapest rates for electricity in the United States, which is, I think, true. But research shows that cheap rates lead to overconsumption.
Uh-huh.
So it's not surprising to find out that for people in poverty, residents of Memphis have the highest electrical bills in the United States. So spending money on energy efficiency, whether it's lighting or equipment, would be a priority there. And since then, MGLW, along with TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, which is who they buy their electricity from, has launched finally an aggressive energy efficiency program with some targeting to the poor. Second one is transit. At one point, Memphis had a transit system that was the envy of the South. I think 136 miles of fixed guideway streetcar within the city limits and some interurban electrics. All that's gone. I mean, the bus routes mimic the routes of the original streetcars without any of the frequency or connectivity or hours of service that they once had. And so many other cities have also struggled with the routing right and the frequency. The hours of service, focusing on the routes most likely to get people because they go to where people actually live now instead of where they used to live, becomes really important. And we actually identified and designed a dozen or so bus routes to more distant job centers that were sort of missing from the map that are finally getting some attention now. Most of those are way out of town. And interestingly, one of the bigger job centers, the Memphis Medical District, doesn't have the kind of coordinated bus service you'd like to see. They've got, I think it's 20,000 jobs in a really tight area. There's hardly anybody living near some of these major medical centers. So most of their workers drive into work.
Right. They provide parking, probably.
That's right. The district may be the biggest parking lot in Memphis. It doesn't make a lot of sense the way some of these things have evolved. So transportation's a big cost in Memphis too. Those are two really good examples there, energy and transportation.
So that transit example is really interesting because, recently Yona Freemark at the Urban Institute came out with a calculation of what it would take to improve service for cities over 100,000 population. And he stated basically if the feds wanted to get involved, you'd spend $16 billion a year to get every city up to Chicago service levels, basically, which I thought was really interesting. But now talking to you for the last 20 minutes or so, I can see that as, you can sell it as a poverty reduction.
That's my point. You don't necessarily need to spend in some of these categories more than is already being spent. Or in other cases, the money really is being spent mostly by the victims of all this, meaning the users.
Right.
So if you can help capture the value of the savings, sort of the equivalent of the way we talk about capturing the real estate value of property, then you got yourself a real winner. So typical household in the United States, as a plug figure, spending about $10,000 a year for transportation. It's more than that in the suburbs and a whole lot of what's called rural America, and it's less in central cities. But that's a big number. So if you want to find out if people are willing to spend money on transportation, anybody who happens to be listening to this, count the number of households in your region and multiply it times 10,000 and multiply that times 30, which is the typical planning period for a long-range transportation plan. You got a really big number. I mean, in a big city like Chicago, I think it's $40 billion a year times 30 years is $1.2 trillion.
Yeah, it's a lot of spending on transportation.
So you can't say the reason for not putting in the canonical half-cent sales tax or whatever the capture mechanism isn't because people aren't willing to spend. I mean, they're sort of leading, as Thoreau said, lives of quiet desperation here. What else are they supposed to do if nobody's offering transit or if the transit won't take you where you're going?
Right.
Or is designed only for the 15% of metro trips that are journey to work and not to help you with the 85% of the trips you're taking for other purposes. So you can go down this then. I mean, I've told you how much anti-poverty benefit there'd have to be. I didn't do what Yona did on his targeted experiment there and say, here's where to get the money. I will tell you that nationally, We've got a GDP of roughly, it was $21 trillion in 2019. So if I take the high end of the anti-poverty benefit we need to get people out of poverty, you don't want to set the target as the poverty line, because somebody can get away with saying, as long as I pay you $1 over that poverty line, you're out of poverty, right? Which is ridiculous. So we set it at 20% over the poverty line in each of those categories, and then calculated it. So depending on the city you're talking about, you're going to need an anti-poverty benefit in the range of $5,000 to $7,000 per person in poverty per year. So if I take the total economy of the United States and the total number of people in poverty, you'd have to spend about 1% of GDP per year to get people out of poverty. And you may not even be any new money to do that. You may simply decide to prioritize as a matter of national priority, or to bundle them together in better ways. It's no favor to people in poverty. They have to go around to 10 different places to assemble the subsidies that are available to you.
Well, it makes me think of things like, Austin is thinking about expanding its freeway through I-35 when really all they have to do is toll the existing road or something along those lines, where you're spending $7 to $9 billion, and it's probably going to be more, right? It usually ends up being more. So $10 billion, let's say.
Right.
That money is to come from somewhere. If you add tolls, you save $10 billion, but you also gain money from tolling as well. So the money shifts that you could actually do, if you think about it hard enough, seem to allow us to actually make these investments in people.
Yeah. And for places that think it's really hard to imagine individuals making the choices to change their behavior or to take advantage of these sorts of things, or to vote for them, it is hard. It's not easy to run these campaigns for taxes, but there may be some other routes to go too. Over half of adult Americans now regularly seek financial counseling, which tends to tell you 50 simple ways to save money. We did an experiment some years ago called Equity Express, in which we got professional nonprofit counselors trained to focus in on just 5 or 6 costs of living and opportunities to reduce it. So we tried this out in Chicago, Oakland, and Cleveland, and we used real programs that people were eligible for, weatherization assistance, or selling a car and signing up for car sharing and transit together. Or a real popular one turned out to be how to get over the jitters of cutting your landline and going with a cell phone. So in your standard Advantage savings account program, an individual development account program, they consider it progress if you could increase savings by 1% per year of your available income. In this Equity Express program, in which you were limited to picking 6 things that could reduce your cost of living, we got the savings rate to between 5 and 6%. So the express part was, if you're saving at 5 times or more the rate that you would be if you're saving for a goal, like to get a down payment for a house, or, I hate to admit it, a car to get to work, a medical savings account, or money to start a business, or an educational goal, it would happen faster, a lot faster. It might take you, without that extra savings, 10 to 12 years to save money for the down payment that you could now pretty confidently accumulate in 2 years. And we're not telling people not to try and get a job if they're unemployed, earn more if they are, and so forth. It's just that by itself, if you're trying to make economic progress, you can only go so far without the savings part of this. So if you look city by city at the recent 2-decade history of both unemployment rates and poverty rates, you can find plenty of examples of unemployment going down, which is the one everybody is sort of riveted by, but the poverty rate's going up because they can't pay the cost of living. Now, the bonus on all this is, of course, because we did it, we had a steady eye towards things that would reduce the cost of living and be environmentally acceptable. And most of the things we ended up recommending are also good for climate change. So here's a case where you could achieve greenhouse gas reduction and lower the cost of living. Wow. That's golden in today's political currency.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned cities. I mean, I guess the investment can be made at any level, at the federal level, state, local.
All levels. Federal, state, central city, town, rural village with 2-block long Main Street. It's just a way of thinking about how to deal with the economy. I remember we wrote a booklet, 10 of us together, called Working Neighborhoods, Taking Charge of Your Local Economy, to sort of lay out the theory of this in 1986. It was really interesting how much pickup there was on the idea that you could take charge of your local economy. Too often the economy is one of these black boxes you're supposed to accept as is and try and figure out how to intersect it, sort of like an on-ramp and an off-ramp on an expressway. But maybe you didn't need the expressway, or maybe the expressway was exactly the wrong thing to invest in. If you're economically struggling as a household, you don't want to invest in things that are going to wear out in a year either. I mean, going back to Memphis, it floods a lot. And you pay a predictable cost every so often in making up for the flooding that occurred. So that's an impairment on your net worth in an accounting framework. So actually retrofitting your neighborhood for green infrastructure or flood protection. And since we were talking before about high air conditioning bills, heat island mitigation by tree canopy restoration, all has an economic value to it. Right now, those things are co-benefits on somebody else's ledger, is my point. And if you'll pardon the expression, I'm sort of a strict integrationist here. When it comes to those co-benefits, why would you leave any of them on the table if they're all there? And yet the way we program for these things almost invariably does. So you want to get people out of poverty, make cost of living reduction and productivity as important as income. Certainly stay the course on income equity, but don't count on it alone. Figure out how to build some economic literacy at a collective level about this and make sure that you aren't missing the opportunity to target these benefits in a way that would result in something like economic inclusion. And you can start to flatten this curve too.
Yeah.
So those are the principles.
My last question, or our last discussion, I guess, will be what this means during the pandemic. And, are we calculating poverty correctly during the pandemic, or are we missing people?
Oh, we're missing them. We're missing them all over the place. So there were a couple of studies in the last couple of months trying to estimate how many more people were in poverty nationally, starting March 1st and going through October 1st. There was one study by a group at Columbia. They came up with 6 million. There was another one by the Center on Budget and Priorities in DC. I mean, I don't think 8 million comes close. They're doing that by projecting off of changes in unemployment numbers and then imputing actual income levels. For obvious reasons, that's not a good way to do it. It's just the data that's available. So my guess is that the numbers are higher. And don't get me wrong, I don't think anybody's in nirvana if they're earning 20% over the poverty level. That's the other problem there, is people really are squeezed hard. Pandemic has created all sorts of cost of living perversities because housing isn't being produced, for example, to speak of. The cost of housing is going up. How about that? Available income's going down and the cost of housing is going up. It's not supposed to do that, right?
Right.
It happened during World War II, by the way. When the war finally broke out, it was clear there was a shortage of critical materials. So Executive Order number 2 of the War Production Board was a ban on the production of new homes and automobiles. And the savings rate went from, I think it was 5% to 22%. So when you read in histories that there was pent-up demand, you're not kidding. So that 22% was a signal to a bunch of America's leading industry that looked like good news to them. As long as you wrap the war up by 1945 or so, they figured, you could get people to start spending money again. And so when you look up something called the National Resources Planning Council, this was the source of everything evil that we're living with today. The idea was to spread out, build new towns, get people to buy amazing appliances, but overall to spend money. In the meantime, during the war, housing was nowhere to be found and expensive. So this leads to the story I told in Hank's book about DC during World War II, which we discussed. And, since then, I've discovered that wherever there was a so-called war production or load center, they called them, a city where a lot of work was going on, you will find that barriers to house sharing were lowered for the duration of the war. In fact, it turned out that I'm living in one. In Evanston, just outside of Chicago. It was a rooming house during World War II. And today there's 40 million adult Americans who are living in somebody else's home, and only half of them are family members. So if you want to talk about a least cost affordable housing strategy, there it is. It's a no-build strategy. We're long on oversized housing and short on the availability of housing overall. The people who are in the business of finding rooms to share tell me that the cost to produce the bed or the unit of housing is the cost of running a screening program for would-be tenants, and the cost per successful placement and retention of applicants over the long term is $3,000. That's the low end of your housing cost profile.
And that's it. Whereas building a new unit might cost here $800,000.
Yeah, try $1 million in the Bay Area is what I think you're up to, if it's an officially affordable unit. There was a GAO report on this a couple of years ago on the high-end stuff. How much was it costing to produce tax credit financed housing? And I think the Bay Area was $700,000 at that point. Chicago was coming in at $400,000 to $500,000. New York City was between the two. The low end was around $200,000 in Phoenix. Since then, it's about $250,000 in Phoenix, which is still too much, right? The only way you can make it pencil is if you've got a housing subsidy for the tenant. By the way, you're at the high end if automatically, if you say you're going to build market rate housing and enforce a set aside, the cost is whatever the market would bear for the market rate housing, plus the ongoing cost to subsidize the rent and the operating expenses. So in between those two, you got all sorts of interesting things being tried to lower the cost of housing. You can take the housing as is and you can retrofit it to try and drastically lower your cost of energy, your cost of water. You can figure out a way to prefab housing or to adapt something else that's been prefab, like a container, and make it into housing. You know, in certain cases, adaptive reuse of post-commercial or post-industrial space works. You can convert rental housing to rent-to-own housing with the intent of turning it into a co-op sitting on a land trust. And you can get by pretty cheap doing that. If you need to fix it up, well, there's something to be said for making a collective decision on how much rehab you're going to do instead of having an arbitrary standard that says everybody's going to have market rate housing. I call that the sort of weak theory of equity, particularly in the Bay Area, right? Right. You shouldn't even try and house somebody unless you're willing to spend $1 million a household. Give me a break.
Right. There's so many more options that should be available.
Right. And by the way, that 40 million adult figure comes from the census, and I suspect it's low. A lot of people don't like to report they're living in a questionably legal situation.
Right.
So there you have it. Another way that poverty happens is to set arbitrarily high standards for the cost of living and then make it illegal to use common sense or lean approaches to actually produce something that people would be satisfied with. That might be an interesting point of rapprochement between people on the right and the left.
It would be interesting to see what folks would actually agree on, although there might be some pushback.
Oh, I'm sure there would be. Pushback, blowback, and clawback all happening at once. Really Darwinian world. Well, anyway, to finish the answer to the pandemic question, first of all, I don't think that 6 to 8 million is the end of the story by a long shot. Number two, I think that based on the informal surveying I did, we don't have cities that understand that resilience can sort of be, learning to work around as a way of life, whether it's about climate or total economic collapse or public health pandemic. And you actually have to be ready. Sarah Campbell once co-authored a paper for TRB about the attributes of best practitioners in transportation systems. There were 6 of them, but the 2 that stuck in my mind forever were the ability to plan for anticipated or known events and the ability to be ready and plan for unanticipated events, also known as the shit happens part of the job description. And I thought that was a really good insight. I don't think resilience has been thought about the right way. I think it would be interesting to do a better cataloging of what people have tried that might sort into a set of principles. I wrote a short piece on this for Joel Rogers with the Mayor's Innovation Project, and we went back and forth on it over a couple of months based on what we knew about practices in cities. It's now called 7 Easy Pieces, Things Every Mayor Should Do. And I think if you think about the various kinds of special purpose offices that have been created since the early 2000s, the sustainability offices, the innovation offices, the Office of Urban Mechanics that were set up in Boston and Philadelphia, and the handful of resilience offices that have survived, these are workaround artists. And I think we could have a really interesting discussion about whether the right thing to do is to start with workaround artists or to bite the bullet and change everybody's job description so that readiness is everybody's job.
I mean, that seems to be the right way to go to me. I mean, if you want to tackle it head on, you should. It's like the whole discussion about equity, too. I mean, you can't just have an office doing it. Everybody has to be focused on it.
Yeah, there you go. Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Officer seems to be a growth industry.
Right. You also mentioned these task forces, too. I mean, the economic recovery.
Only a handful of them, amazingly. I mean, try looking it up on the internet. There just aren't that many. It always pays to have collective engagement around these things. And instead, look what we've got during the pandemic. I mean, everybody is treated to the spectacle. You know, even on your local NPR station every night, listening to governors give you the daily body counts and positivity rates and the social distancing orders. I mean, you need to do it, but that can't be the whole show.
Right. I think that's been frustrating for a lot of folks, especially working in agencies. And I've heard this from folks too, is that, you know, that's great to know all those things that you were talking about, but what is the plan going forward for, you know, how do you figure out how full your transit vehicle should be when only half of the population is vaccinated or something along those lines? That's something, those types of things.
Right. That's a good one. Do you ever read 100 Years of Solitude?
No. I have not.
By Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It happens in a Central American village someplace. And part of the history of the place, which is what the 100 Years recounts, is what happens when an American entrepreneur comes to town, plants a banana plantation, and starts extracting the wealth of the region out of there. And people finally get angry at him, and with a great flourish, he announces, it wasn't quite a press conference, that he's leaving by train and wishes the people well. And somebody asks him, "Hey, Mr. So-and-so, are you ever going to come back?" And he looks up at the sky and he says, "Yes, when the rain stops." It hadn't rained in a couple of years at that point. Like 10 minutes later, it started raining and it didn't stop for the next 30 years. So, you know, people seem to think you can turn these things on and off, or the government, some sort of magic machine. All you have to do is declare an emergency and you've got the powers to make things happen. And it's terrible. It's not a good way to do things. You need to sort of leverage people to do things together. And the difference between this kind of crash and, let's say, World War II is that people were asked to do things. They were asked to, you know, build victory gardens. They were asked to grow food. They were asked to provide services. They were asked to put everybody to work. You know, we don't see any of that really going on right now. And the extent that it's going on, we don't know about it. It's not part of the information that's officially being tracked. You know, again, as far as I'm concerned, this is another way that poor people stay poor. Maybe they're not paying taxes, but they're certainly paying rent. They're certainly paying higher prices for goods and services for things that don't make economic sense anymore. Have you ever read any of the literature about what's called poverty traps?
No, I haven't.
It's really interesting. So a poverty trap exists whenever you have a cultural norm or a regulation that forces you to spend money, whether you like it or not. I remember attending a session the Ford Foundation paid for at Brookings, and I was the odd guy out. Everybody else was a cultural anthropologist stationed somewhere around the world, trying to figure out where are all these traps located. In India, for example, there's the practice of having big families, and it's just sort of a cultural mandate, all family members chipping in to pay for the most elaborate weddings imaginable to celebrate it, resulting in lots of poor people with third and fourth mortgages so that they can keep paying for the cost of weddings. You know, I got invited because I've made the observation that forcing everybody to drive is a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Or to live in places that are going to have high energy and water bills. So, you know, we shouldn't be designing our communities to be poverty traps. It's an excellent example of how thinking of it only as a physical design exercise or an art exercise for those architects, even though they won't admit they're into style, they really are. And ignoring the actual cost of living is wrong.
It reminds me of that discussion about towing and impounding cars when they ask you to pay a fee and you might not have the money and then you don't have a car to get to work either. And that's that circular logic of getting stuck somewhere because of the rules that exist. And it's frustrating to see how that happens over and over again. And like you said, you know, there's multiple ways it can manifest.
Right. One poverty trap's going on right now is people think it's wonderful. You can finally push a button and have your groceries show up. But you're paying for it. Believe me, you're paying for it. It's not pretty. how much extra you're paying for it. It's a really bizarre shift that we've just gone through, Jeff, where the traffic has returned, and yet it's hard to recognize that a big part of it, whether it's in trucks or cars, is bringing goods and services to people rather than people to goods and services.
Right. And the perverse incentives that creates too, because you're creating these weird switches in where the money is going to.
Exactly. And where the money isn't going anymore isn't available to be taxed either.
Right. Like central business districts, there's not a downtown crowd.
And main streets.
Yeah. And so that money goes to Amazon and whoever else.
No, it's not good. I mean, there's better ways of moving goods around, but there hasn't been time to think about this the right way. One thing I didn't say is that when I started thinking about the idea, Jeff, of poverty reduction as a goal, I made myself sit back and say, why the hell is it so easy to get large numbers of people excited about adopting a climate goal of, reducing greenhouse gases? And it's so hard to get people to adopt a goal of economic inclusion. And I really don't know the answer. I have theories there. I think economic illiteracy runs deep. Is one reason. People think it's an impossibly high bar. And maybe everybody is just racist. Who knows? Although I don't really believe that. A few months back, I took the time to sign up for webinars where all sorts of leading activists were advertising their sessions about come find out about how to set goals for inclusion and making up for the sins of the past. And, I ended up with a reputation because I always managed to get a question in there. Does anybody here have recommendations on specific goals for what that inclusion looks like? And more often than not, the answer was no. That part of the conversation hasn't happened yet. I think we're seeing a lot of conversations about what reparations might look like, but I don't see us actually saying, well, if this is what the disparity curves look like, then the parity curve needs to look like this. How quickly do we need to do it, and what's our options for how to do it?
I wonder if it's because people aren't abstract. A ton of carbon is abstract, right? It's something you can target. You can target through, businesses and things like that.
Yeah, you may be, but here's another one. It was very difficult to get the idea across that anything at the subnational level other than a company could set goals for saving energy. And as part of the evidence, none of the original 6 pieces of federal authorizing legislation for what became the Department of Energy through a tortuous path gave them any authority to deal with cities. None. And most of the energy that people were complaining about having to import, which for transportation, other than new technology, DOE wasn't given any authority to deal with that. That was DOT. DOT didn't take any authority to do it. They left it up to EPA to say VMT reduction could be an optional voluntary activity to reduce emissions, which is a public health problem. It was really hard to get people to adopt a goal to save energy in buildings. In fact, when the idea first came out, it was defined as adopting building performance standards. And, that was actually called a socialist conspiracy. So, there's some value to labeling things, certainly, I guess. But I think it's worth probing a little bit more deeply. So if we can get people to adopt goals for climate protection, and some large fraction of those actually deliver economic benefits to the poor, not just people who are in the middle class and above, then maybe we can get somewhere.
I hope so.
Hope springs eternal. All we got, Jeff.
Always positive. All right. Thanks, Scott.
All right, hang in there, man. Always good to talk.
Talk